Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, bless his holy name.
Hi, thanks for tuning into Armor of God again. And as always, thanks to all of you for always taking the time to be here with us. And I always hope that whenever you're watching the videos here, you're always learning a lot and learning about useful stuff, especially when it comes to spiritual warfare. Anyway, as we're coming to the end of 2024, I've selected several clips that I've shared with all of you this year and put these clips together to sort of wrap up this year's highlight in this compilation. Now I've provided you with the timestamps in the pinned comment below, so feel free to go through the list because this video is going to be very long. And I know not all will have the time to watch and listen until the end, but try to learn as much from these clips, even if you have listened to them before. So I'm going to start this super long compilation with this clip of Father John here.
And I've prayed with people like that. I blessed their room, and I said, okay. So somehow you've attracted to yourself a spirit. They're incubus spirits and succubus spirits. One's a female spirit, one's a male spirit that attack people. And I've had people tell me that they felt violated, okay? They've been involved in something of grave sin because that invites the demon to attach himself. It's like pornography. A person views that, gets involved in that, then all of a sudden they can't quite turn it off. And then it's really fascinating. Then they go to confession, they find it much easier to say. It's not as compelling. I definitely believe with pornography, with some drugs, with some music, that there are demons associated with that.
And I've also shared a lot of videos covering about hell, not because I want you to really focus on hell and the demons. If one is to look at the thumbnails alone, I wouldn't blame them if they think this channel focused too much on Lucifer, hell, the demons, etc. But if one actually looked closer, out of 10 clips in a compilation for example, the clips that cover hell or demons are probably 3 out of 10, while the rest are clips of the priests talking about Jesus, heaven, the church, theology, basically our faith as a whole. And of course we know some people out there seem to have the idea that the people who are damned to hell will be able to leave hell and make it to heaven someday. So that is why I feel it's important to remind people that this is a false idea.
Souls who are lost for all eternity. Once you're in hell, there's no getting out, and it's an eternal place just like heaven. Except, of course, heaven is bliss, glory, happiness, union with the beatific vision and will of God. Hell is the counterpart, the opposite. It's eternal remorse of conscience in the company of Satan. Faustina describes 9, I believe, tortures of the damned for all eternity. There's screaming, there's blasphemy, there's darkness, there's a stench, there's the presence of Satan, there's the remorse of conscience, and the list goes on. And this is an eternal state. I want to make that clear.
I've also shared a lot of clips of Father Carlos Martins this year, and I've learned so much from listening to him, and I hope the same goes for you too. And so naturally, I have to include one from him too in this compilation.
A priest, in his praying, doesn't desire to inflict torture for the sake of inflicting torture. The freeing of the victim is the end for all of his actions. Why would a priest desire to torture a demon? Because it feels good to him? If that is the case, to take pleasure out of someone else's suffering is a perversion. A Christian may feel a sense of justice, but he needs to be extremely careful when he experiences delight at even a demon's suffering, because that delight is mirroring the psychological state of the demons themselves.
And we're also blessed to have the opportunity to interview the exorcist from the Philippines, Father Winston. And I know a lot of our brothers and sisters from the Philippines watching the videos here, so I really want to say thank you so much for being here with us.
The occult third eye is fundamentally the organ for divination, much like the eyes are the organ for seeing. Why? Because the occult third eye perceives invisible things. Just like the eye, our biological eyes, perceives material or physical things. How well developed the third eye is based on the power that it is able to manifest. It starts with sensing, feeling, without seeing. And then afterwards, you hear voices. And then you smell unusual odors. Then finally, you see frontally, or you see auras. Oftentimes, we seem to see things on the periphery of our eyes. But when you see frontally, then it means that your third eye is fairly well developed. And the highest form of the manifestation of the third eye is to be able to talk or communicate with the spirit world. The spirit world of the fallen spirits, not the world of God, of the holy angels, and the saints.
And of course, if you've been with us for a while now, you know that I have been sharing a lot of stuff from Father Joseph Iannuzzi, and it's actually because of him that I am no longer afraid to spread the message of obedience to the Pope, the Magisterium, walking side by side with the Church in my videos. Anyway, let's start with this one.
You had in the Old Testament, and at the time of Christ, what's called the Talmud. It's not the Bible. It's an ancillary work that's supposed to help guide them in their conduct of life. But if you read the Talmud, you'll be shocked what it contains. It's nothing like the Bible. And many of them were espousing these crazy teachings. Another one is called the Kabbalah. In English, they say Kabbalah. In Hebrew, it's Kabbalah. And the chief chapter of that is called the Zohar. I studied that with a rabbi for 1 year. I took a course of Jewish mystical theology, reading the Talmud, the Torah, the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah is really the spiritual, mystical work of the Jews. And, of course, we reference the Mishnah. Now, you'll be surprised what's in the Zohar. It talks about compromising with the devil. I'm not making this up. So there's some weird teachings in there, right? And therefore, Jesus, when he issued these 7 woes to the scribes and Pharisees, it was because they were deliberately misinterpreting him. They didn't have to do that, but they wanted to. Not because they were ignorant or uneducated or lacked the skills, no. It was because they were worshiping another God. So they were already closing the door in Jesus' face. They didn't want that kind of God. They wanted their kind of God, you see? So they were already judging him, not based so much on his words. They were using his words to condemn him, trying to trap him. They were already closed from the beginning to his word. They wanted their God. Jesus issued 7 woes to them, basically saying they're headed for hell. In many occasions, called them a tomb of dead man's bones, that they build the graves of the prophets, and that they will be there doing their, he said their father is the Satan. He called their synagogue the synagogue of Satan. Why was that? Because at the time of Christ, they had the Hebrews, the Jews. There were good Jews and there were bad Jews, just like today. And you had the bad Jews worshiping Baal, which is Satan. This goes all the way back, even before Moses, before they built the golden calf, way before that. You have the sons of Noah already. One of them went in the wrong direction. And they were worshiping Lucifer.
For me personally, listening to Monsignor Stephen Rossetti is like listening to my own grandfather. And of course, if you have the time, please do join his online deliverance session on the St. Michael Center for Spiritual Renewal channel. Anyway, this clip is not long, but it's a clip of him answering the question, will our pets make it to heaven?
People often ask it, but I think it's good to answer it. Is there a pet heaven? Do pets go to heaven? Is my dog in heaven? You know, first of all, let me say, I love dogs. I love cats, really. I love animals. I sometimes I say I wish I'd become a veterinarian. I don't think we have any priest veterinarians, but I love animals. I love all the animals. I feed the birds out back, and I love animals. As a matter of fact, I have a bird about bath this morning, was doing a dirt bath. It's so fun to watch this little bird do this dirt bath. So anyway, love animals. Do they go to heaven? Well, first of all, technically no, because what is heaven? See, heaven's not just a nice place. Heaven is being united with the Lord, united with divinity, having God's very divine life flow through us. That's heaven. And wow, I mean, that's something that is, because of Jesus' humanity, we're raised as divinity. So animals don't do that. But let me say this. It's kind of actually a complicated question, because whatever God creates, it's always created good, even though the demons rejected God. But God's creation is good. Dogs and cats are good, but God created them. And we know that in the next life, he will, there'll be a new heavens and a new earth. All of this will be transformed, including all your dogs and cats, into the kingdom. How or what, we don't know. So But rest assured that God loves your cats and dogs. He created them, and he will somehow transform them into the new creation. But another comment I heard from a young priest the other day, and I thought he nailed it. And this was it. He said, look, maybe who knows what happens to cats and dogs, whatever. But heaven, when we are united to God, he said, is God going to be enough for you? Do you need your dog? No. When the Lord is part of our lives, it's unbelievable. It's incredible. It is incredible. And God is all in all. Saints, when they get touched by the Lord's presence, it just transforms them. And we realize that God is beyond what you can possibly imagine. So God will be enough for us. But don't worry, he'll take care of your dogs and cats. He loves them. He made them.
And Father Reehil is also another priest that we've listened to a lot this year. This clip right here is him answering the question, can demons manifest with smell?
Yeah, smells. So can the saints, by the way. So it's not uncommon. The demons leave behind foul odors. So sulfur, rotting, decaying flesh, things like that. Whereas sometimes if you're praying to St. Therese, you'll get roses. You could even smell roses. Sometimes when Padre Pio is in the room, people are known to sometimes smell his tobacco or Joseph lilies, who knows. But yeah, they have powers we don't have in this life, so they can do that. What if you sense there's something in your house that's malevolent, then you want to get rid of it. So I would call a priest to have your house be blessed and exorcised.
Earlier, I've shared a clip of Father Winston talking about the occult third eye. And this clip here is not in any way to guide you how to open the said eye, but it's to inform so we're aware of the dangers and what to do and the things we should not do.
How is the third eye opened? First, inherited from ancestors with an open third eye. The spirit goes down because of the consecration made. If the person, the occult practitioner, has used the power several times and profited from that power, then it goes into the bloodline. The demon goes into the bloodline. It can also happen by accident through multiple contacts with the occult, an occult practitioner, or with someone whose third eye is open. Multiple contacts with the occult or with someone whose third eye is open. Always in contact with a person whose third eye is open. And the third one is through trauma. By way of a trauma, either due to a near-death experience or strong emotional shock. So the third eye is opened in three ways. You inherit it, you accidentally open it through constant interaction with occult practitioners, or by way of a trauma to a near-death experience or strong emotional shock. And the fourth one is you induced. You want to have that power through a deliberate desire to have it opened or through occult means or ritual. If you can open it, it can also be closed. There is a caveat. If you open it and it does get opened, you relate to the spirit of evil, the spirit of divination. And you cannot close it on your own because now one is bonded to the spirit of divination. The only way to close it is to return back to God. A true conversion. Why? Because when we open ourselves to the occult, we forsake our baptismal vows. You reject all His works and empty promises. Now knowing that the spirit of divination is not from God, then we relate back to the evil spirits. So how is it closed? One, first and foremost, a sincere, definitive, honest-to-goodness renouncement of the spirit of divination and all the powers given by these demons. If the person has become a medium, a demon that comes in and out will be commonly encountered and the battle will be long. Because if we have given our bodies to be used by the spirits, you cannot renounce. Why? Because the spirits will prevent you from renouncing. Total renouncement of the spirit of divination and its powers is absolutely necessary, without which no liberation can be achieve. In expelling the spirit of divination in a person deeply ingrained in the practice of the occult, demonic possession will most probably occur if the person has not devoutly prepared spiritually. You cannot go to a priest and say, Father, I want to close my occult third eye. Just like that. You have to undergo a process of conversion, a true turning back to God. It's not a magical thing, because if one has been using the power for so long or deeply ingrained in the practice of the cult, then possession will definitely occur. How is it closed? Exorcism of the spirit of divination and the occult third eye. While using the oil of catechumens or blessed oil in the locality of the third eye, and if necessary, the senses that have been affected by it, eyes, ears, nose, lips, chest, hands, feet, and this is to be done by a priest. Then you now consecrate. Remember, the psychic abilities have been bonded to the unclean spirits. And if one has the psychic abilities present, and you expel the unclean spirits, those psychic abilities now must belong to God. And we do this by consecration of the ability to the Blessed Mother. The priest will also seal the location of the third eye and other senses with holy chrism as a sign of the reconsecration of the person back to God. Remember that when we attach ourselves to the spirit of divination, to the use of the occult third eye, we rebuke or we forsake our baptismal promises and our faith as well. And therefore, we need to be reconsecrated back to God.
Now on to the subject of exorcisms. In the early days, I've shared a lot of clips where the exorcists talk a lot about exorcisms, but these days, I don't really share it anymore. Not because I don't want to, it's just that we've covered the subject many times before. However, for this compilation, I'll just include this one right here from Father Reehil.
Satan and the demons operate in, you could say, two classes of ways, in the ordinary and the extraordinary, in the natural and the supernatural. So the supernatural is vexation and obsession, oppression, and possession is the deepest form. And these are when there's a supernatural effect on the person. They can change their voice. They can even turn their skull structure into that of like an animal. So very bizarre behavior. And of course, in full possession, they have possession of the body, not the soul. The person can't really do what they want to do when that happens. And as I mentioned, they kind of check out when the demon is in the first position. But being possessed does not put you in hell, because everything that person is doing when the demon is acting is under the influence of the demon, not the person. So what you say is true. The door that opened to let the demon in could be a sin that is grave matter. But the first course of action we do with people who come to us, if they're Catholic, is take them through the sacraments, because the sacraments have the most power. And so step one would be to have the person go to confession. You know, somebody who's possessed, they're not possessed 24 hours a day. I mean, the demon is there 24 hours a day, but it doesn't manifest in them 24 hours a day. They have long periods of being completely aware and lucid where they can go to confession. And when they are forgiven, all those sins are gone. If they were to die in a state of possession, they would leave that body, and they would go to either purgatory or heaven. The demon, of course, doesn't go with them. They're not allowed to access to heaven. So the thing we need to worry about is the normal or the natural way they attack, which is through temptation. And that is what can get you in hell. If you commit sins that are of grave matter, and and you don't have the forgiveness from God at the point of death, that would be a terrible plight.
The gaming industry these days isn't as innocent as it once was back in the days.
Hello!
And these days, however, the satanic elements are so obvious. One just have to look at one of the most successful games in history, the GTA series, and there's a new one coming out soon. So I'm glad that Father Reehil covered this very subject before.
It's come to my attention that the gaming industry, so these video games that the kids are watching, has taken a severely dark and twisted turn in the last 10 years. I guess the genesis of this would be like when I was a kid, Pac-Man, fairly harmless, and things like that. But now, very dark. Be careful what your kids are watching. If you have teenagers, you might want to have a chat with them and say, some of these games they're not games at all. They're portals into hell, and you're inviting demons into our home. And there was actually a case where there was a teenager playing these dark games, and when he left the house at 22, the parents moved into his bedroom, and they had all sorts of manifestations happening. And it turns out it's from these games. And the boy had to have deliverance done over him and the house as a result. So you got to be careful. This is not, it's like, I guess the equivalent when we were kids was the Ouija board, but now it's these three-dimensional looking video games where you're actually tangling with demons. And you may think it's a cartoon, but the demons don't care. Once they get your consent, they have you. So be careful.
Anyway, going back to the few examples that I talked about earlier, let me share with you a few of the games to drive the point home here.
A spirit board. Am I really getting that absent-minded, or was it actually here before? Isn't there supposed to be some kind of indicator to use for the letters? A planchette? Or something? I guess I could use a glass instead. Hopefully the demons won't mind. Can't believe I'm actually trying to.
I wish to contact the spirit of Aldwin Atkinson. I call out, are you present with me?
And then this game is where the players will be using their microphone to communicate with the dead housemaid.
Where are you? Oh God, what?
And for the clip of Father Iannuzzi here is from my interview with him earlier this year, and it's his explanation to this question that I asked him. What do the guardian angels do when those who worship the devil perform the satanic rituals?
It's a good question. We find the answer to this in the writings that are endorsed or approved by the Church with its official seals of approval, namely the imprimatur and the nihil obstat, from the saints, the writings of the saints that are approved by the Church. And we find that the angels weep when we do something sinful. We're all given a guardian angel. And this is a teaching of several saints, Saint Alphonse de Liguori and others, at conception. Now, some people may be given more. Padre Pio addresses this as well, depending upon their mission, their universal mission and vocation in the Church. So naturally, the Blessed Virgin Mary had many angels accompanying everything she thought, said, and did, and bringing these divine acts that she performed that were sinless, that participated in God's one eternal act to the throne of God to increase the accidental glory of not only themselves, but the saints in heaven, and alleviate the souls in purgatory sufferings. Now, our guardian angels, we all have one guardian angel. And when we do something sinful, it causes them to weep. Why? Because they are pure spirits. They have no stain, no imperfection in them. They are pure emanations of God's love. And when they see sin, or they experience it, and they have to because they're always by our side 24/7, even when we sleep, they lose, in a way, some of that accidental glory that they would have otherwise received had we done something good. So we affect them as well, not just God. So they weep not only for God's sufferings on account of sin, but because of their own opportunities lost to grow in the glory of God through our good acts on earth, which are replaced by sinful acts. And you mentioned something about Satanists whenever they do rituals or something like that. What do their guardian angels do? Yeah, this is really a travesty, because some of these souls may be lost for all eternity, and their guardian angels will carry that with them for all eternity. That is the loss of the soul to whom they were entrusted. But the guardian angels are not blamed by God if a soul should not follow the will of God or lose its own immortal soul to Satan, because they are commissioned to do exactly what God asks of them, and that is to light, to govern, to guide, to protect. And the letter to the Hebrews speaks of the angels and says that we don't serve them, they serve us. Now, why is that? It's because, and this has to do with why Lucifer rebelled against God in heaven, because Jesus, according to the teachings of St. Polycarp, who was a disciple of St. John the Evangelist, and the disciple of Polycarp was St. Irenaeus, according to Polycarp, St. John the Evangelist taught that God revealed to Lucifer before he became evil or rebelled against God, that the second person of the Trinity would assume a human and not an angelic nature. And Satan did not want to serve a rational being that was inferior to him intellectually, which we are. So he said, I will not serve this plan. And Lucifer did not enjoy the beatific vision. Had he passed that test and accepted God's plan, he would have been admitted to the beatific vision, because once you enjoy the beatific vision, you cannot sin. So you see, Lucifer still could have sinned, meaning he was not yet admitted to that beatific vision. And therefore, the letter to the Hebrews, when he states that we serve, I'm paraphrasing, we serve God and the angels serve us, it's because, in part, of what St. Paul says, that in the end we will judge angels. So even though the angels surpass us intellectually, rationally, because of the incarnation of Christ into human nature, we surpass them in nobility. And therefore our guardian angels will always carry that loss of a soul if it goes to hell through unrepentant satanic rituals. And but remember, even though it carries that loss, there's a certain joy in the fact that God's justice is impeccable. So if a soul is lost, it's not the fault of the angel, it's not the fault of God, it's the fault of that soul. And God's justice is glorified in heaven as much as his mercy. So they don't, let's say, they don't live in a state of sorrow in heaven, the guardian angels. They rejoice in the justice of God as well.
And I'm sure some of you noticed Father Iannuzzi said accidental glory in that clip just now, and I asked him to elaborate this a little bit more so that there won't be any confusion in regards to this term he used here.
Okay, let's take an analogy which always helps to make it accessible on a practical level. Consider, I'll use what Mother Angelica used. Here you have a nun without any formal theological training, and yet she had a penchant to be able to bring down in practical terms some theological truth, and what she used was a sunset. She said, okay, suppose you're sitting down and you see a sunset, and you enjoy the beauty of that vision you're beholding. You may hear the warbling of the birds, you may experience the aromas of the flowers, etc. That doesn't change your essential glory, meaning the fruits of your own meritorious actions, but it impacts accidentally your glory. Now, these are philosophical terms, accidents and essence, substance and form. We use this for the Eucharist as well. The accidents are the external, the bread and the wine. They don't change, but the substance of the bread and the wine does. It is replaced. The substance of the bread and the wine at the moment of the consecration is replaced by the substance of Christ's body, blood, soul, and divinity, whereby it is substantially God, but accidentally what it was before, the bread and the wine. So when we speak of increasing the accidental glory of the angels and saints, what we're talking about is impacting their eternal glory for all eternity due to no merit of their own, but due to our merit. That's the difference. Their essential glory is their own merit. The accidental glory is what is given to them on account of another's doing. increased our accidental glory, so did the Blessed Mother, so did the angels and saints, through their protection, their guidance, their illumination, their intercession, etc.
I've also shared a lot about offering up our sufferings to God, either in the videos or on the community posts. And I've also seen a lot of non-Catholics who listen to this whole thing about sufferings and offering them up to God. Once they begin to really understand what the Church teaches about it, they'll begin to accept their sufferings more willingly and offering them up to God for the salvation of souls.
We can sacrifice, and sacrifice is very pleasing to God. Through our sacrifices, vicariously offered with joy, we can save souls from hell and convert souls on earth from their errant ways. We can repair for sins, even our own, but always united with the sacrifice of Christ. Remember, sacrifice and suffering in and of themselves are useless. There is no merit or value to sacrifice or suffering in and of itself. But when united with the cross of Christ, that is, when we intend with our minds to offer up this particular sacrifice or suffering or sorrow or pain, and unite that with our intention to Christ on the cross, then that sacrifice or suffering, which in and of itself has no value, becomes redemptive, meritorious, and salvific by virtue of our intentionality. That's how important intentionality is. To this particular, let's say, situation of a person dying, that they may be saved, or for the conversion of my nephew or niece, or for a bad sister in the family, or two bad sisters in the family, we can offer up these sufferings for their conversion. Now, we can't force them to do anything that God wants them to do, for which we pray, but at least we can dispose them to have the grace, whether they accept it or not, so that when they meet God, they cannot say that God did not provide them with grace of conversion or salvation, etc.
And I've also included a lot of clips where these priests share their cases with us, what they did, what they experienced, and one of those priests is Father Reehil.
Just a few months ago, I was at a case at a town about 2 hours from Nashville, and there was a woman from Guatemala. Her name was Angelica, and what had happened was the local parish priest, she was feeling very sick, an illness like in her stomach, and so they called the priest to anoint her, and the priest came to anoint her. When he put his stole on, her eyes rolled back in her head, and she started to growl. And he said, well, you don't need an anointing, you need an exorcism. And so he called me, and I went and met with her. And she was surrounded by her whole family, and they were very devout people, very devout people. They all had rosaries they were praying. The house was filled with all of these beautiful statues and icons. And she was delivered that day. It took about an hour and a half, but at the end of the day, the demon left. It was the spirit of Lilith, which the parents had seen it in the house. It was like a black-winged creature with bird feet. And they showed me a picture. They took a picture on their camera. It's very bizarre. Normally, demons don't show up in pictures, but this thing did. And it was creating a problem with her health. You know, that's also one of the things that can happen. That's sort of like what we would call like, it could be a vexation. Somebody could have put a spell or a curse on her, and it was manifesting in ways that were in her health. But when I directly started confronting the demon, it was in her stomach initially where she felt it, and as the more we prayed, it was coming up through her throat, and finally it was lodged in the back of her mouth, and it wasn't coming out. That last little bit took a while, and finally when it left, it came out through her mouth and left the room. But very strange that I was kind of impressed that it happened so quickly, because, and I think it had to do with the prayer of her family, that they were so interceding so powerfully for her. So it's a very, another good weapon is to have people around you who are going to lift you up and make you a better Christian, a better Catholic.
For the next clip, the reason why I shared this before was because I've seen so many videos out there who claim to be a prophet or sharing this revelation or that revelation. One of these was during the days after the attempted assassination of President Trump, and so I feel it's important to share this clip from Father Iannuzzi here.
Now, I said this before and I'll say it again, and I'm not incriminating anyone. I'm just saying it as a matter of fact for the spiritual welfare of your own benefit, of your own soul. For every one prophet God sends, that's true, Satan will send 10 that are false. How does he send them? Some are deliberate in their deception, but I believe the majority are deceived. The majority are thinking that their own entering into the state is God bringing them there and only God talking, and that's not the case. God may inspire. This is not the same thing as a substantial locution. Inspiration is not a substantial locution. So formal locutions and successive locutions are inspirations. They're nothing more. And they're receiving in these inspirations both messages, patterns of thought, ideas, words from God, from themselves sometimes, and even from the devil. And they can't distinguish between the three because they don't have someone in whom they confide. If you ask these seers, who is your spiritual director, they won't give you an answer because they don't have one. That's already a dangerous sign. They're relying upon themselves and they're going to get it wrong every time. A true mystic always has a spiritual guide. You'll find this throughout the history of Christianity, every single time. God has never given the church a prophet or a mystic in the New Testament without giving him a spiritual guide, always a priest. You notice that? Every single time. Because the priests are the ones actually trained in discerning these things and knowing doctrine, what's heresy, what's schismatic, etc. But substantial locution is completely different. You could be talking to someone, you could be playing, you could be recreating, and it hits you. You don't have to dispose yourself, number one. And number two, these substantial locutions, John of the Cross says, enter the substance, hence the word substantial, of the soul, unlike formal and successives that do not enter the substance of the soul. I can go into this more in detail, but I want to limit myself just to that.
And I would like to include another clip of Monsignor Rossetti in this compilation, where he shared about the kids drawing pentagram at their school. And it's not difficult to figure out how they had this idea in the first place, considering there are many movies out there that are doing all these occult stuff, such as playing the spirit board.
My daughter saw kids drawing pentagrams with chalk last year on the floor at recess, playing a game. They chanted, "Let's summon a demon." And should I be worried about that? Yes. No, we have someone right now who, several people say, well, I was involved with the occult when I was younger, but it was just a game. But, obviously Satan didn't think so. Just because you think it's a game doesn't mean you're not summoning demons. So be careful. And kids can summon demons, yes, even if they think it's a game. And there have been lots of disasters with kids playing with Ouija boards, whatever, thinking it's a parlor game. So, yeah, and what we need, our parents, frankly, parents, you need to teach your kids. In these days of Harry Potter and all these sort of witch stuff, you need to teach your kids. It's not okay. It's spiritually dangerous. And you can't just sort of shunt it aside. Teach your kids. Tell them about this. It's not good.
And here's another one of Monsignor Rossetti, because I think this is quite an interesting question that he's addressing.
My daughter gave me a little doll from New Orleans with the word voodoo on the package. It says it is to look after the best mom in the world. Should I get rid of it? The answer is yes. Here's the thing. That's typical of pagan occult religions. They say we're going to summon these good spirits, these guiding spirits, whatever, and they're going to watch over you. They're demons. You're going to ask a demon to watch over you? That's what you're doing. And they're not going to. That's one of the big mistakes of people in the occult today, and the Wicca and all that kind of stuff, witchcraft. They think I've got guiding spirits that are watching over me. I'm invoking them. No, you're not. You're in league with the demons, and you're going to pay for it. So do not invoke any kind of spirits except for the Holy Spirit. God in heaven, His beautiful saints and angels. Invoke your guardian angel. You do have a guardian angel. That's the one you ask your guardian angel to help you. We love our guardian angels. You should talk to your guardian angel, by the way. I love mine.
Many months ago, I shared a clip of Monsignor Rossetti where the video was talking about people eating demons. He was with someone who can see demons, and they were about to eat the food when she saw little demons on the food. And it was not until Monsignor Rossetti prayed over the food that those little demons disappeared. In this video, however, I'd like to share this conversation between this lady here with Father Daniel Reehil.
is how should one pray for one's safety and well-being when people handle our food that publicly display crystal necklaces, tattoos of demonic images, pendants, and other demonic items in the grocery store, at restaurants, and other related places. Sometimes I overthink about things, and especially if they're handling my food, and I say a blessing over my food, but sometimes just overthinking kind of gets to me a little bit.
Okay, first of all, with food, I say bless everything you're putting in your mouth, whether it be an aspirin, a stick of gum, an apple, or a sandwich, or a meal, whatever. Bless everything. Now, if you specifically see somebody with pentagrams, earrings, or tattoos handling your food, then I might go a step further and say, in the name of Jesus Christ, I bind all spirits not of the Holy Spirit off of this food, and I break any curses in the name of Jesus Christ off my food. If you specifically see someone who is a Satanist or seems to be of that ilk, then you can go the extra step. And do that, but the blessing, the grace prayer is good for almost everything. But I would go a little further if you have somebody that looks like they're in the devil camp.
And we've also covered the subject of being sexually attacked by the demons during my interview with Father Winston before. And more importantly, what led to these demons attack someone sexually in the first place. I think this is the more important information here, and one of the reasons is when someone does something like this woman here.
The scratches, that is what we call now, oftentimes, those are signs of oppression, attacks on the body. Okay? So scratches in any part of the body where the person is unaware. When he wakes up, he finds scratches on himself or herself. Now, I am assuming what you're saying is that the person does not scratch himself unaware, no? Because that is a possibility that you scratch yourself unaware, thinking, and then you wake up thinking that it is somebody else. So if you find that you have a scratch at your back and you can never reach your back, so you can assume that you had this. Now, succubus, incubus attacks is an attack on a person. So a woman that is attacked in her dreams is called an incubus. And a man that is attacked in his dreams is called a succubus. Why in his dreams? Because he's not aware. But sometimes one is also aware that he is being sexually attacked. So when one is sexually attacked, spirits do not have sex. Evil spirits do not have sex. So even a woman might experience being attacked by a male demon, but she can also be attacked by a female demon, a demon that pretends to be female, or a demon that pretends to be male. In the same token, that men can also be sexually attacked, meaning they experience that they are being sexually harassed or raped in that context, and they could not move, they are paralyzed. We call this night terrors, that the person cannot do anything, as if being paralyzed. And the person, the attacking evil spirit, would probably appear first and foremost, first as a beautiful woman or handsome man, and then seduce the person, and the person would eventually give in to the seduction and then start to do things, sexual acts. But then once the person they're already doing it, the demon manifests itself as a demon or as a monster. So those are succubus attacks and incubus attacks. Now, when you ask, why does that occur? How does that occur? If the house that the person lives in is infested by evil spirit, or that in the house where that occurred, the house has been used for evil purposes like orgies, sexual deviation, drug abuse, for example, or even for infidelities, perversities, then the house has been contaminated by a lustful spirit, which may affect a person that is sensitive or vulnerable if the person sleeps there. Okay, so that does happen. And when you ask why some persons are affected, in our experience, oftentimes, if this occurs on a regular basis on a person, it is possible that the person had been sexually molested in the past by a human being. So the vulnerability is now there because of the emotional trauma. So this is what we often see in cases of frequent succubus or incubus attacks. And this can happen to anyone. It can happen to regular persons. It can happen to religious men. It can happen to religious women. So it's because it is rooted in the traumatic experience. So if a person had traumatic experience that is connected sexually, then it is possible that the incubus and succubus attacks are connected with that.
For the next several clips, they're going to be of Father Reehil and Father Iannuzzi. And although this clip of Father is very short, but it's also very helpful to me personally, because I experienced what Father Reehil said in the clip a lot of times before.
When you have, not all of our emotions are ours, and you can be experiencing emotions that come out of the blue. Like if you wake up and you're in a good mood and suddenly you just go into a foul mood for no good reason. So nothing has happened. Nobody cut you off on the road. Your toaster didn't burn your breakfast. There's no good reason. Suddenly you're in a bad mood. That to me is a sign that's not your emotion, that's a demon poking at you.
And one of my favorite parts, whenever I listen to these priests, not only Father Reehil here, but every other priest that I've listened to before, I love it whenever they share stories with us, especially one like this.
I lost my phone, and I was sitting in adoration when I realized I didn't have it, and I was just looking around, and it wasn't in my pew, and I thought, wow, where's the phone? So as soon as somebody showed up where I could step out of adoration, I went and looked in the office, I looked in the sacristy, it was gone. Looked in the car, and I said, wow, the phone is gone. So I need the phone to help your people, Lord. So if you could show me where the phone is, that'd be great. And I went back to praying, and I had in my mind, I could see sort of from a heavenly perspective, looking down on my house on the deck outside. Behind the deck, there's these bushes that border the railing, and under the bushes was the phone. And I'm thinking, am I making this up in my head? So I go home, I go out on the deck, I go down the steps, under the deck, under the bushes, and there's the phone. Now, I didn't know the phone was there. So clearly that was a divine revelation. Here's your phone, go get it. And that even makes for a better experience, because then you're like, wow, you're really 100% with me here, and even in the little things like finding my phone.
We have another channel called Everything Catholic, and it's a channel that's dedicated to the lives of the saints. And one of the saints that we love to cover is St Padre Pio. And so let me share this clip of Father Iannuzzi talking about St Pio here.
St Padre Pio a Pietrelcina. And Padre Pio, in his letters of exchange, I have all 4 volumes. They're thick epistolaries. He uses the word fiat a lot. And just to share with you some things you might not know about Padre Pio, because he was very modest, and he used to, because of his shy temperament, avoid people and used to weep when he heard people cry. He was very sensitive to sin. There was another saint that was so sensitive to sin that he could smell it, namely St. Philip Neri. But getting back to Padre Pio, most people don't realize that apart from his mystical experiences, he underwent a long and painful surgery of a hernia operation on October 10th, 1925, and he refused anesthesia. Imagine that. Now, the reason he did, I'm sure, was in part to offer up the suffering for souls, but also because his superiors put him under obedience not to show his wounds to anyone. And when he saw the doctor, who was a devout Catholic, He said to the doctor, when he was asked, would you like anesthesia? And he said, no. Would you have the discipline to not observe my wounds if I'm under anesthesia? And the doctor honestly said, no, I would probably examine them. And that's why Padre Pio refused the anesthesia in obedience to his superior. Imagine that, just so the doctor couldn't see his wounds. But eventually he did pass out from the pain. The doctor actually gave him a liqueur in Italian. That's about 40 strength. He said to Padre Pio, at least take one glass of this. It's like it's called a digestive. There are different types in Italy, like Fernet, Aderna, Ramazzotti. You take it after the meal to help the digestion because it has a lot of herbs, like 40 herbs in it, but it's very strong. So he gave Padre a small little glass of this 40% herb elixir. He drank it, and then he said to Padre Pio, would you like another one? And Padre Pio said, look, if you ask me that, I'm going to get in a fist fight with you before the operation. So he didn't go beyond that one. Anyway, Padre Pio went through a lot of physical struggles and not just spiritual struggles. And in addition to that hernia situation, he also suffered from severe health conditions and a fluid buildup in the chest. And in 1957, he developed asthma that required specialists and had chronic issues with the ears and the throat. So from 1966 till 1968, he had hours of temperature highs and lows, increases and decreases, and this went on for hours. And so in a word, Padre Pio knows what it is to suffer health issues and to get old. Just because he was a mystic didn't mean he was exempt from a human existence. So he suffered the full gamut of what we experience as well. And his body, as you know, was incorrupt in San Giovanni Rotondo. They moved it from the old crypt to the modern new crypt.
And this clip of Father Iannuzzi here, I think will be helpful for you in understanding the whole thing about how God operates.
God never speaks to us directly. He always uses an intermediary, whether it's an angel, whether it's a human being. You may say, yes, well, God spoke to us directly through Christ. Well, he didn't speak to you directly, did he? He spoke directly to those who were alive in his time. But Christ didn't write one word. God, the Father or Son didn't, or Spirit didn't write one word. But they used people to write their words, you see? And here's where the literary challenges enter. For someone who's not docile to the workings of the Holy Spirit, that is, allows themselves to be instructed by how God operates, and instead insists on God operating the way they expect, will end up condemning the whole Bible, because the Bible contains many literary forms that are literally incorrect and even heretical if you take them literally. Like the earth is founded upon pillars and the sky is a dome. If your hand offends you, cut it off. You can pick up serpents and not be poisoned. You take these things literally, you'll all be dead or blind or lamed or something like that. So these things are not supposed to be taken to the letter. And unfortunately, those people who condemn certain writings that the church has acknowledged as authentic lack the method of the church to interpret properly the intended meaning of the sacred author, whether it's Jesus Christ, the apostles. And this reveals their ignorance and their lack of docility. It's really what it does, because they don't acknowledge how God operates, but they insist on God operating the way they expect. And that's wrong. God does not have to conform to their expectations, and he won't. Rather, God does what he wants. And he has chosen over the last 6,000 years to communicate always through an intermediary. So God avails himself of, so does Mary, the impoverished, limited language with which we are capable of expressing ourselves or divine realities.
Father Reehil, out of the many priests I've listened to, I think the one that covers about Hollywood the most. I'm sure there are many others though. And so anyway, earlier this year he talked a little bit about Hollywood celebrities like Jennifer Aniston going to the psychic, talking to the dead, and to ask for information.
Just today I was reading an article this morning, which, nothing surprises me anymore. I read stuff and used to surprise me, used to shock me, no more. So there's a woman who is a psychic, a sorceress of sorts, and the New York Times wrote an article about her because she's the psychic to the stars, apparently. And so many of these high-profile people, like Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston, among many others, go to her for her to channel the dead and give them information about their lives, about the future, about whatever. Now, the Bible, the scriptures are very clear. We are never to try to conjure the dead, ever. But the worst part of this is that she's not contacting the dead. She's contacting demons who are impersonating the dead. And she's charging, over $1,000 an hour to talk to demons. Can you imagine? What a fool. But these people, the thing that really got my attention and really irritated me is because now she's claiming that 2 of the dead she's been contacting and been speaking with lately have been Jesus and his mother Mary. Well, honey, I just want to tell you, you didn't read the end of the gospel. Jesus rose from the dead, and he is alive and sitting on the throne, hearing and answer prayers. He doesn't need to communicate with us through you, and he would never do such a thing, nor would his mother, by the way. So this woman, and the New York Times, I would say, is kind of a co-conspirator in this. They're putting this out there for the masses. Now, the problem, this is a problem in and of itself and for these people that are using her. But the bigger problem for me is these people like Aniston and Pitt, they've got millions and millions of followers that listen to their every word, that cling to their words, that are following them all over the place. And now these poor bums, whoever is listening to these people, there's a risk they might think this is real and start trying to do it themselves. And so they're going to open the door to demons. Don't ever go to a psychic or a medium or anybody who claims that they can contact the dead or anybody else. People say to me, but they couldn't have known this information because I was the only one who heard those words from my mother or my father. Well, guess what? You have a guardian angel that's next to your side every minute of the day. That angel heard those words. Now, he's not going to share them with anybody because he's working for the good guy. He's working for Jesus. But there's also demons that are in the room around you, and they hear the things that are said in private, and then they can repeat them to other demons that come back through the medium and give you this secret information, making you think you talked to your dearly departed loved one. You didn't. You're talking to a demon who knows things about you that only you and private revelation to people in your life would know. Don't be deceived. So you mustn't do it. Don't do it. Terrible, terrible, terrible. But having said that, we can understand why people are anxious. Certainly I can, because again, the media moguls are pushing out the stories they want you to hear. Not necessarily the truth, not necessarily the whole news, not necessarily everything that's happening, just what they want you to hear.
In the following clip, Father Reehil talked about how demons are clinging to us when we commit sins. And while putting this video together, I thought about how I wasn't taught about this, and not until I started listening to these exorcists.
The other thing people don't know, even a lot of priests, when we commit sins, we have demons attached to us, and they drag us down, and they make life very hard and miserable. When you go to confession, not only are you absolved, but the demons are broken off of you, and they have to flee once the absolution takes place. So you're also going to feel even lighter because you won't have those demons clinging to you anymore.
If the angels can't read our thoughts, how would they know what we're praying to them? Before I share the clip here, let me briefly explain. When we talk about praying to angels, we're talking about communicating with them, honoring them, asking their prayers and intercession, but not worshiping them.
Angels, and saints for that matter, they don't have access to your thoughts unless you're addressing them, even if it's just in your mind. So if you're praying the rosary and you're saying, Hail Mary, full of grace, you're speaking to Our Lady, she will be able to know that you're praying that rosary, and she can hear your prayer requests. If you are speaking to your guardian angel, or for that matter, St. Anthony, you're looking for a parking spot. Please, St. Anthony, I can't find a spot. Can you help me find a parking spot? Even something silly like that. It opens the pipeline directly to that saint, so they can hear what your prayer is. But if you're just in general thinking, daydreaming, no, they're not just watching your daydreaming thoughts and listening to your thoughts. No. Similarly, demons, they listen when you speak to them if you address them, and they're always looking to try to dialogue with you because that's how they trick you. So do not pretend even to talk to demons or do any of the silly games that are out there to kind of invoke a demon. Don't do it, because whether you're kidding or not, they take it seriously and they will show up, and that will not be a good thing.
If demons can possess people, what about the good angels? Can they possess people too? It's a very logical question since the demons are angels to begin with.
Can they? Probably. But would they? No. Because angels are working out of virtue and purity. And so they would never try to take possession of something that wasn't rightfully theirs, would they? No. That's like, the Holy Spirit. Is he capable of fully possessing somebody? Sure is. Does he? Not really. I mean, we can invite him, but it would be a rare day that God would suddenly impose himself on us for no good reason. He's a gentleman. The Lord is always inviting. He's always welcoming us. His arms are always open to receive us, but he does not force himself on us, because that would violate free will. And he doesn't do that. But when you see some of these saints who have these mystical visions and ecstasies, in a way that is the Spirit dwelling with them in such a powerful way that they are literally giving themselves over, that they're fully animated by God. And that's what happens in those rare cases when the soul is so united to God that they're just completely inflamed with his love, and they can really do nothing but just adore and worship him in those moments. Yeah, what they do constantly try to inspire us, and they try to lead us and guide us and protect us, but they will not force.
And this year, we have shared a lot of times the visions of Blessed Anne Catherine with you. And out of the many we shared with you, I picked 3. We've also asked Father Iannuzzi before, and bear this in mind, this is his area of expertise, mystical and dogmatic theology. The writings on Blessed Anne Catherine, even though it's not written by her, are approved by the Church, and that is why we feel comfortable sharing them with you. We wouldn't do it unless we know it's not, but after asking Father Iannuzzi personally about it, whether it's safe to read them, and they are, that's why we're sharing them with you.
The building of the Tower of Babel was the work of pride. The builders aimed at constructing something according to their own ideas, and thus resist the guidance of God. When the children of Noah had become very numerous, the proudest and most experienced among them met to resolve upon the execution of some work so great and so strong as to be the wonder of all ages to come, and cause the builders to be spoken of as the most skillful, the most powerful of men. They thought not of God, they sought only their own glory. Had it been otherwise, as I was distinctly told, God would have allowed their undertaking to succeed. The children of Shem took no active part in the work. They dwelt in a level country where palm trees and similar choice fruit grow. They were, however, obliged to contribute something toward the building, for they did not dwell so far distant at that period as they did later. The Tower of Babel was built upon rising ground, about 2 leagues in circumference, around which lay an extensive plain covered with fields, gardens, and trees. To the foundations of the tower, that is up to its first story, 25 very broad stone walks led from all sides of the plain. 25 tribes were engaged in the building, and each tribe had its own road to the tower. Off in the distance, where these roads began, each tribe had its own particular city, that in time of danger or attack they might flee to the tower for shelter. The tower was intended likewise to serve as a temple for their idolatrous worship. The stone roads were, where they took their rise in the plain, tolerably far apart. But around the tower they lay so close that the intervening spaces were not greater than the breadth of a wide street. Before reaching the tower, they were connected by cross arches, and between every 2 there opened a gateway about 10 feet wide into its base. When these gently inclined roads had reached a certain height, they were pierced by single arcades. Near the tower the arcades were double, one above the other, so that through them one could make the circuit of the building even around the lowest part under all the roads. Above the arches that connected the inclined roads were walks or streets, running horizontally around the tower. Those gently rising roads extended like the roots of a tree. They were designed in part as supporting counterpillars to strengthen the foundation of the immense building, and partly as roads for the conveyance from all points of building materials and other loads to the first story of the tower. Between these extended bases were encampments upon substructures of stone. In many places, the tops of the tents rose above the roads that ran through them. From every encampment, steps cut in the walls led up to the walks. One could go all around the tower, through the encampments and arches, and under the stone roads. Besides the occupants of the encampments, there were others who lived in the vaults and spaces on either side of the stone roads. In and around the whole building swarmed innumerable living beings. It was like a huge ant-hill. Countless elephants, asses, and camels toiled up and down the roads with their heavy burdens. Although these burdens were far broader than the animals themselves, yet several could, with ease pass one another on the roads. On them were halting places for feeding and unloading the animals, also tents on the level spaces and even factories. I saw animals without a guide bearing their burdens up and down. The gateways in the basement of the tower led into a labyrinth of halls, passages, and chambers. From this lower part of the tower, one could mount by steps cut out on all sides. The interior at this point consisted of cellars, immense and secure, covered chambers, and passages. The building was begun on all sides at once. All tended to one central point, where at first stood a large encampment. They used tiles, also immense hewed stones, which they hauled to the site. The surface of the walks was quite white, and it glistened in the sun. At a distance, the sight it presented was wonderful. The tower was planned most skillfully. I was told that it would have been finished and would now be standing as a magnificent monument of human skill had it been erected to the honor of God. But the builders thought not of God. Their work was the offspring of presumption. The names of those that had contributed to the grandeur and magnificence of the building were inscribed with words of praise in the vaults and on the pillars, in the former by means of different colored stones, and on the latter in large characters. There were no kings, but only the heads of the different families, and they ruled according to common counsel. The stones employed in the building were skillfully wrought. They fitted into one another, held one another together. There were no raised figures on the building, but many parts of it were inlaid with colored stones, and here and there were figures hewn in niches. Canals and cisterns were constructed for water supplies. All lent a helping hand. Even the women trod the clay with their feet. The men worked with breast and arms bare, the most distinguished wearing a little cap with a button. Even in very early times, women kept the head covered. The building so increased in bulk and height that on account of the shade it cast, it was quite cold on one side, while on the other the reflection of the sun's rays made it very hot. For 30 years, the work went on. They were at the second story. They had already encircled and walled in the interior with tower-like columns, had already recorded their names and races thereon in colored stones when the confusion broke forth. I saw one sent by God, Melchizedek, going around among the leaders and the masters of the building. He called upon them to account for their conduct, and he announced to them the chastisement of God. And now began the confusion. Many who had up to this time worked on peaceably, now boasted their skill and the great services they had rendered in the undertaking. They formed parties, they laid claim to certain privileges. This occasioned contradictions, animosities, and rebellion. There were at first only 2 tribes among the disaffected, and these, it was resolved, should be put down. But soon it was discovered that disunion existed among all. They struggled among themselves, they slew one another, they could no longer make themselves understood by one another, and so at last they separated and scattered over the whole earth. When in my childhood I had the vision of the building of the tower, I used to reject it because I could not understand it. I had, of course, seen nothing like it, no buildings but our farmhouses and the city of Coesfeld. More than once I thought it must be heaven, but I had the vision again and again, and always in the same way I see it still, and I have also seen how it looked in Job's time. One of the chief leaders in the tower building was Nimrod. He was afterward honored as a deity under the name of Belus. He was the founder of the race that honored Derketo and Semiramis as goddesses. He built Babylon out of the stones of the tower, and Semiramis greatly embellished it. He also laid the foundation of Nineveh and built substructures of stones for tent dwellings. He was a great hunter and tyrant. At that period, savage animals were very numerous, and they committed fearful ravages. The hunting expeditions fitted out against them were as grand as military expeditions. They who slew these wild animals were honored as gods. Nimrod also, that is, where the door serves as an egress for the smoke as well as for the cows, drove men together and subdued them. He practiced idolatry. He was full of cruelty and witchcraft, and he had many descendants. He lived to be about 270 years old. He was of sallow complexion, and from early youth he had led a wild life. He was an instrument of the devil, and very much given to star worship. Of the numerous figures and pictures that he traced in the planets and constellations, and according to which he prophesied concerning the different nations and countries, he sought to reproduce representations which he set up as gods. The Egyptians owe their sphinx to him, as also their many-armed and many-headed idols. For 70 years, Nimrod busied himself with the histories of these idols, with ceremonial details relative to their worship and the sacrifices to be offered them, also with the forming of the pagan priesthood. By his diabolical wisdom and power, he had subjected the races that he led to the building of the tower. When the confusion of tongues arose, many of those tribes broke away from him, and the wildest of them followed Mizraim into Egypt. Nimrod built Babylon, subjected the country around, and laid the foundation of the Babylonian Empire. Among his numerous children were Ninus and Derketo. The last mentioned was honored as a goddess. From Derketo to Semiramis, I saw 3 generations of daughters. Derketo was a tall, powerful woman. I saw her clothed in skins with numerous straps and animals' tails hanging about her. Her head was covered by a cap made of the feathers of birds. I saw her with a great train of followers, male and female, sallying forth from the neighborhood of Babylon. She was constantly in vision or engaged in prophesying, offering sacrifice, founding cities, or roving about. She and her followers drove before them scattered tribes with their herds, prophesied on the subject of good dwelling places, piled up stones, some of which were immense, offered sacrifice, and practiced all kinds of wickedness. She drew all to herself. She was sometimes here, sometimes there. She was everywhere honored. She had in her old age a daughter who played a part similar to her own. I saw this vision in a plain by which was signified the origin of the abomination. Lastly, I saw Derketo as a frightful old woman in a city by the sea. She was again carrying on her sorcery by the seashore. She was in a state of diabolical ecstasy, and she was proclaiming to her people that she must die for them, give her life for them. She told them that she could remain with them no longer, but that she would be transformed into a fish, and as such be always near them. She gave directions for the worship to be paid her, and in presence of the assembled multitude, plunged into the sea. Soon after, a fish arose above the waves, and the people saluted it with sacrifices and abominations of all kinds. Their divinations were full of mysteries, signs, etc., connected with water. Through Derketo's instrumentality, an entire system of idolatry arose. After Derketo, I saw another woman, the daughter of Derketo. This was still in Nimrod's time, for they belonged to the same age. I saw this daughter leading a life even wilder and more violent than her mother's had been. She was engaged most of her time in hunting, attended by crowds of followers. She often went to a distance of 300 miles, pursued wild animals, offered sacrifice, practiced witchcraft, and prophesied. In this way, numerous places were founded and idolatrous worship established. I saw this woman fall into the sea while struggling with a hippopotamus. Her daughter Semiramis I saw surrounded by all the kingdoms and treasures of the world, as if the devil were showing them to her, giving them to her. I saw that Semiramis put the finishing touch to every abomination of the Babylonian race. In the earliest times, power over others was held more peaceably and was vested in many. Later on, unlimited jurisdiction was possessed by single individuals. These latter then became the leaders, the gods of their followers, and they formulated various systems of idolatrous worship, each according to his own ideas. They could also perform wonders of skill, valor, and invention, for they were full of the spirit of darkness. Thence arose whole tribes, first rulers and priests combined, later of priests alone. I have seen that in those days women of this stamp were more numerous than men. They were all in interior communication, connected with one another by feelings, thoughts, and influence. Many things narrated of them are imperfect recitals of their ecstatic or mesmeric expressions relative to themselves, their origin, their doings, uttered sometimes by themselves, at others by their devilish clairvoyance. The Jews also had many secret arts in Egypt, but Moses, the seer of God, rooted them out. Among the rabbis, however, many such things existed as points of learning. Later on, these secret arts became low, vulgar practices among wandering tribes, and they still exist in witchcraft and superstition. But they have all sprung from the same tree of corruption, from the same low kingdom of darkness. I see the visions of all that engage in such practices either just above or entirely under the earth. There is an element of the same in magnetism. Water was held specially sacred by those early idolaters. It entered into all their service. Whether divinations or ecstasies, they always began by a gazing into water. They had ponds consecrated to that purpose. After some time, their ecstatic state became habitual, and even without the aid of water, they had their evil visions. I have seen the way in which they had those visions, and it was indeed singular. The whole earth with all that it contained seemed to be once more under water, but veiled as in a dark sphere. I saw that those enchantresses beheld all that was going on, wars, nations, perils, etc., just as is done at the present day, only with this difference that the former put what they saw into effect, made good what they saw. Here was a nation to be subdued, here one to be taken by surprise, there a city to be built. Here were famous men and women, and there was the plan by which they might be outwitted. In fine, every item of their diabolical worship was seen before reduced to practice by those females. Derceto saw in vision that she should cast herself into the sea and be transformed into a fish, and what she saw she hesitated not to carry into effect. Even the abominations practiced in their worship were all mirrored in the water before they put them into execution. In the age in which Derceto's daughter lived, dikes and roads began to be constructed. She raided down into Egypt itself. Her whole life was one series of movings and hunting expeditions. Her adherents belonged to the tribe that had plundered Job in Arabia. The diabolical worship of Derceto's people became systematized first in Egypt. Here it took such hold that while the witches sat in the temples and in chambers on strange-looking seats before various kinds of mirrors, their visions, communicated while actually seen, were reported by the priests to hundreds of men who engraved them upon the stone walls of caverns. Strange that I should see all those abominable chief instruments of darkness always in unconscious communion with one another. I saw similar actions and things going on in different places among similar instruments of the evil one. The only difference among them was that which arose from the diversity of manners and customs among the several nations and the different degrees of depravity into which they had fallen. Some had not as yet sunk so deep in these abominations, and were not so far removed from the truth. Those, for instance, from whom the family of Abraham and the races of Job and the 3 kings sprang, as also the star worshippers of Chaldea, and they that had the shining star. When Jesus Christ came upon earth, when the earth was soaked with his blood, the fierce influence of such practices was considerably diminished, and witchcraft lost much of its power. Moses was a seer from his cradle, but he was according to God, and he always practiced what he saw. Derceto, her daughter, and her granddaughter Semiramis lived to be very old, according to the general age of that time. They were tall, powerful, mighty, such as would almost frighten us in our day. They were inconceivably bold, fierce, shameless, and they carried out with astonishing assurance whatever the evil one had shown them in vision. They felt their own power, they thought themselves divinities. It is touching to see how the holy patriarchs, although they had frequent revelations from God, had nevertheless to suffer and to struggle unremittingly in order to keep clear of the abominations that surrounded them. And again, is it affecting to remember in what secret, what painful ways salvation at last came upon earth, while all went well with demonolatry, while all things were made to subserve its interests. When I saw all this, the immense influence exercised by those goddesses and the high worship they received over all the earth, and on the other side, when I contemplated Mary's little band with whose symbolical picture in the cloud of Elias the philosophers of Cyprus sought to couple their lying abominations, when I saw Jesus, the fulfillment of all promises, poor and patient, standing before them, teaching, and afterward going to meet his cross. Ah, that made me inexpressibly sad. But after all, this is the history of the truth, and the light ever shining in the darkness, and the darkness not comprehending it. And so it has been, and so it is still, the same old story, even down to our own day. But the mercy of God is infinite. I have seen that at the time of the flood, many, very many, were saved from eternal punishment. Fright and anguish converted them to God. They went to purgatory, and Jesus freed them on his descent into hell. Numbers of trees escaped being uprooted by the waters of the flood. I saw them thriving again, but most of them were covered, choked up by mud. As the Blessed Virgin felt her end approaching, in accordance with the directions of her divine Son, she called the apostles to her by prayer. She was now in her 63rd year. At the time of Christ's birth, she was in her 15th. Before his ascension, Jesus had made known to his most holy mother what she should say at the end of her earthly career to the apostles and some of the disciples who should be with her. He told her also that she should bless them, and that it would conduce very much to their welfare and eternal salvation. He entrusted to her also certain spiritual labors for the general good, which being accomplished, her longing after heaven was to be realized. Jesus had at the same time made known to Magdalene that she was to live concealed in the wilderness, and that Martha was to establish a community of women. He added that he himself would always be with them. At the prayer of the Blessed Virgin, the apostles received, through angels, an admonition to repair to her at Ephesus. In the various places in which they were, they had erected little churches here and there. Many of them were constructed merely of platted rods or branches covered with clay, but all were of the same form as Mary's house, that is, three-cornered in the back. They were provided with altars for the celebration of Holy Mass. The journeys of the apostles, so distant, so exceedingly remote, were not made without divine assistance. Although they themselves were perhaps unconscious of it at the time, yet I do not doubt that they passed through many dangers in a supernatural manner. I often saw them walking unnoticed through the midst of a crowd. I have likewise seen that the miracles wrought by them among the various pagan nations were very numerous and of a different kind from those recorded of them in the Holy Scriptures. They labored everywhere according to the peculiar needs of the people. I saw that they carried about them the bones of the prophets or those of the first Christian martyrs, which relics they placed before them in time of prayer or when offering the holy sacrifice. When called to Mary, Peter was in the region of Antioch with another apostle. Andrew, who had shortly before been in Jerusalem, but had there been persecuted, was not far from Peter. I saw them both on their way to Ephesus at places not very distant from each other. They passed the nights in those open inns that are met along the roads in hot countries. As Peter was lying one night near a wall, a resplendent youth approached him, took him by the hand, and bade him arise and hasten to Mary. On the way, the youth said, he would meet Andrew. Peter, who had grown stiff from age and fatigue, rose to a sitting posture, and clasping his hands round his knees to support himself, listened to the angel's words. Then he stood up, put on his mantle, girded himself, took his staff, and started on his journey. He soon came up with Andrew, who had been called by the same apparition. After traveling some distance, they were met by Thaddeus, who also had received a similar warning. They journeyed together to Mary, with whom they found John. Jude Thaddeus and Simon were in Persia when they received their summons. Thomas, who was in stature thick and short and had reddish-brown or auburn hair, was of all the apostles the farthest off. He arrived only after Mary's death. When the angel came to call him, he was praying in a hut built of reeds. With one very poor, simple servant, I saw him sailing alone in a little boat far over the waters. Then he journeyed across the country, turning aside from all the cities. A disciple now accompanied him. Thomas was in India when he received the warning. Before receiving it, he had determined to go into Tartary, and he could not bring himself to change his plans. He always wanted to do so much. Therefore it was that he was often behind time. So off he started northward almost across China, where Russia now is. Here he was called a second time. He obeyed the summons and hurried to Ephesus. Thomas did not return to Tartary after Mary's death. He was pierced with a lance in India. I have seen that he set up a stone in this last-named country, upon which he knelt in prayer, and upon which the marks of his knees remained impressed. He told the people that when the sea would reach that stone, another would here preach Jesus Christ. John had shortly before been in Jericho, for he often journeyed to Palestine. He usually abode in Ephesus, however, and the country around, Bartholomew was in Asia east of the Red Sea. He was handsome and very active, his complexion fair and his forehead high. He had large eyes, black curly hair, and a short, crisp beard, black and parted on the chin. He had already converted a king and all the royal family. Paul was not summoned. Those only were called that were related or acquainted with the Holy Family. Peter, Andrew, and John were the first to reach the Blessed Virgin's house. She was already near death. She was lying calmly on her couch in her sleeping place. I saw the maidservant looking very sorrowful in this and that corner of the house, also outdoors, where she prayed prostrate with outstretched arms. I saw also 2 of Mary's sisters and 5 disciples coming together to the house. All looked tired and exhausted. They embraced each other tenderly when they met. Many wept from mingled feelings of joy and sorrow at meeting on such an occasion. When the apostles went all together into Mary's little sleeping chamber in order to take leave of her, they wore their long white albs and broad mantles. The screens that separated the front from the back of the house had been removed. The disciples and holy women remained standing in the front apartment. I saw that Mary sat upright, that the apostles knelt in turn at the side of her couch, and that she prayed over each and blessed him with her hands laid upon him crosswise. She did the same to the disciples and to the women. One of the latter, who stood quite bent in 2 over Mary, received an embrace from her. When Peter stepped up to the couch, I saw that he had a roll of scriptures in his hand. Mary then addressed them in a body, and did all that Jesus had in Bethania directed her to do. I saw also that she told John what was to be done with her remains, and that he should see that her clothes were divided between her own maidservant and a maiden of the neighborhood who came sometimes to render her service. As she spoke, she pointed to the press or partition, and I saw the maid going to it, opening and closing it. And now the altar with its covers, one red, the other white, was placed in front of the crucifix of the Blessed Virgin's own oratory. Peter here celebrated the Holy Mass with the same ceremonies as I had seen him first observe in the church at the pool of Bethsaida. Tapers, not lamps, were burning on the altar. Mary was in a sitting posture on her couch during the whole celebration. Peter was vested in the large mantle and the pallium, whose colors glanced from white to red. These he wore over the white robe. The 4 apostles assisting him were also vested in festal mantles. After the communion, Peter gave the Blessed Sacrament to all present. During this Holy Mass, Philip arrived from Egypt. Weeping bitterly, he received the benediction of the Blessed Virgin, and after the others, the Blessed Sacrament. Peter bore the Blessed Sacrament to Mary and the cross hanging on his breast, and John carried on a shallow dish, the chalice containing the most sacred blood. This chalice was white, small as if for pouring, and of the same shape as that used at the Last Supper. Its stem was so short that it could be held with 2 fingers only. Thaddeus now brought forward a little incense basin. Peter first gave the Blessed Virgin the last anointing, just as that sacrament is administered at the present day. Next he administered Holy Communion, which she received sitting up without support. Then she sank back again on her pillow, and after the apostles had offered a short prayer, she received the chalice from John, but not now in so upright a posture. After communion, Mary spoke no more. Her countenance, blooming and smiling as in youth, was raised above. I no longer saw the roof of her chamber, and the lamp appeared to be suspended in the open air. A pathway of light arose from Mary up to the heavenly Jerusalem, up to the throne of the most holy Trinity. On either side of this pathway I saw clouds of light out of which gazed angelic faces. Mary raised her arms to the heavenly Jerusalem. Her body with all its wrappings was floating so high above the couch that I could see under it. A figure of light, also with upraised arms, appeared to issue from Mary. The 2 choirs of angels united under this figure and soared up with it, as if separating it from the body, which now sank back upon the couch, the hands crossed upon the breast. Many holy souls, among whom I recognized Joseph, Anne, John the Baptist, Zachary, and Elizabeth, came to meet her. But up she soared, followed by them, to her son, whose wounds were flashing light far more brilliant than that which surrounded him. He received her and placed in her hand a scepter, pointing at the same time over the whole circumference of the earth. At last I saw, and the sight filled me with joy, a multitude of souls released from purgatory and soaring up to heaven, and I received the surety that every year, on the feast of Mary's Assumption, many of her devout clients are freed from purgatory. The hour of Mary's death was made known to me as that of none, at which time also Jesus had died on the cross. Peter and John likewise must have seen the glory of Mary's blessed soul, for their faces were turned upward, but the other apostles were kneeling bowed to the ground. The body of the Blessed Virgin lay radiant with light upon the couch, the eyes closed, the hands crossed upon the breast. All present knelt, adoring God. At last the women covered the blessed remains with a sheet, put all the furniture of the house aside and covered it, even covering the fireplace. Then they veiled themselves and prayed together in a space in the front of the house, sometimes kneeling, sometimes sitting. The apostles, too, enveloped their head with the scarf they wore about their shoulders, and ranged in order for prayer. They took turns, 2 at a time, to kneel and pray at the head and feet of the blessed remains. I saw them exchanging places with one another 4 times in the day, and I likewise saw them making the way of the cross. Andrew and Matthias were busy preparing the place of burial, which was the little grotto that Mary and John had arranged at the end of the way of the cross to represent the holy sepulchre of Christ. It was not so large as Jesus' tomb, being scarcely as high as a man, and was surrounded by a little garden hedged in by stakes. A pathway ran obliquely down into it, and the stone couch, which was like a narrow altar, was hollowed on top to the shape of a body enveloped in its winding sheet, the head being a trifle higher than the foot. The station of Mount Calvary was on a hill nearby. No cross was erected on it, but there was one cut out on the stone. Andrew was especially active in preparing the grotto and setting up a door firmly in front of the tomb proper. Before the holy body was shrouded in its white garments and enveloped in the winding sheets, Peter celebrated the unbloody sacrifice on the altar of the oratory and gave Holy Communion to the other apostles. After that, Peter and John approached the body in their mantles of ceremony. John carried a vessel of oil, with which Peter anointed, in the form of a cross and with accompanying prayers, the forehead, hands, and feet of the holy body, which was afterward entirely enveloped in linens by the women. They placed on the head a wreath of flowers, white, red, and sky blue, as a symbol of Mary's virginity, and over the face a transparent veil, through which it could be seen encircled by the wreath. The feet also, which were bound up in aromatic herbs, could be traced through the linens that enveloped them. The arms and hands were bound crosswise on the breast. Thus prepared, the holy body was laid in a coffin of snow-white wood with a tightly fitting arched cover, which was fastened down at the head, the foot, and in the middle with gray straps. The coffin was then laid on a litter. Everything was done with the utmost solemnity, and all were penetrated with deep emotion. The sorrow of the mourners was more human and more openly expressed than at Jesus' burial, at which holy awe and reverence predominated. When it was time to bear the coffin to the grotto, 1/2 hour distant, Peter and John raised it from the litter and carried it in their hands to the door of the house, outside of which it was again laid on the litter, which Peter and John then raised upon their shoulders. 6 of the apostles thus carried it in turn. The coffin hung between the bearers as in a cradle, for the poles of the litter were run through leathern straps or matting. Some of the apostles walked before the coffin praying, and after it came the women. Lamps or lanterns on poles were carried. Before reaching the grotto, the litter was set down. 4 of the apostles bore the coffin in and placed it in the hollow of the tomb. All went one by one into the grotto, where they knelt in prayer before the holy body, honoring it and taking leave of it. Then the tomb was shut in by a wicker screen that extended from the front edge of the tomb to the top of the vaulted wall above. Before the entrance of the grotto, they made a trench, which they planted so thickly with blooming flowers and bushes covered with berries that one could gain access to it only from the side, and that only by making his way through the underwood. On the night following the burial took place the bodily assumption of the Blessed Virgin into heaven. I saw on this night several of the apostles and holy women in the little garden, praying and singing psalms before the grotto. I saw a broad pathway of light descend from heaven and rest upon the tomb. In it were circles of glory full of angels, in the midst of whom the resplendent soul of the Blessed Virgin came floating down. Before her went her divine Son, the marks of his wounds flashing with light. In the innermost circle, that which surrounded the holy soul of Mary, the angels appeared like the faces of very young children. In the second circle, they were like those of children from 6 to 8 years old. and in the outermost, like the faces of youths, I could clearly distinguish only the face, the rest of the figure consisting of perfectly transparent light. Encircling the head of the Blessed Virgin like a crown was a choir of blessed spirits. I know not what those present saw of all this, but I saw that some gazed up in amazement and adoration, while others cast themselves prostrate in fright upon the earth. These apparitions, becoming more and more distinct as they approached nearer, floated over the grotto, and another pathway of light issued from it and arose to the heavenly Jerusalem. The blessed soul of Mary, floating before Jesus, penetrated through the rock and into the tomb, out of which she again arose radiant with light in her glorified body, and escorted by the entire multitude of celestial spirits, returned in triumph to the heavenly Jerusalem. Next day, when the apostles were engaged in choir service, Thomas made his appearance with two companions. One was a disciple named Jonathan Elisar, and the other a servant from the most remote country of the three holy kings. Thomas was greatly grieved when he heard that the Blessed Virgin was already buried. He wept with an abundance of tears quite astonishing to behold, for he could not forgive himself for coming so late. Weeping bitterly, he threw himself, with Jonathan at his side, on the spot upon which the blessed soul of Mary had left her body, and afterward knelt long before the altar. The apostles, who had not interrupted their choir chanting on account of his coming, now gathered around him, raised him up, embraced him, and set before him and his companions bread, honey, and some kind of beverage in little jugs. After that, they accompanied him with lights to the tomb. Two disciples bent the shrubbery to one side. Thomas, Elisar, and John went in and prayed before the coffin. Then John loosened the 3 straps that bound it, for it rose high enough above the trough-like couch to admit of being opened. They stood the lid of the coffin on one side, and to their intense astonishment beheld only the empty winding sheets lying like a husk or shell, and in perfect order. Only over the face was it drawn apart, and over the breast slightly opened. The swathing bands of the arms and hands lay separate, as if gently drawn off, but in perfect order. The apostles gazed in amazement, their hands raised. John cried out, "She is no longer here!" The others came in quickly, wept, prayed, looking upward with raised arms, and finally cast themselves on the ground, remembering the radiant cloud of the preceding night. Then rising, they took the winding sheet just as it was, all the grave linens, and the coffin to keep as relics, and returned to the house by the holy way, praying and singing psalms. When they entered the house, John laid the folded linens on a little flap table before the altar. Thomas and the others were in prayer, but Peter went a little apart, as if pondering some mystery. After that, I saw him celebrating divine service at the altar before Mary's crucifix, and the apostles standing in order behind him, praying and singing. The women were standing in the doorways and by the walls of the fireplace. The young servant that had come with Thomas looked quite unlike any of those present. He had small eyes, high cheekbones, forehead and nose remarkably flat, and his complexion was brownish. He was already baptized. He was perfectly innocent and obeyed orders simply. He did all that he was told, remained standing or sitting wherever they told him to do so, turned his eyes in any direction indicated to see whatever was pointed out to him, and smiled upon everyone. When Thomas wept, he wept also. He always remained with Thomas, and I saw him dragging immense stones when Thomas was building a chapel. I often saw the apostles and disciples standing together in circles and relating where they had been and giving their experience. Before the apostles left Mary's house to journey again into distant parts, they rendered the grotto of the tomb wholly inaccessible by raising an embankment of earth before the entrance. At the rear, however, they made a low passage to the back wall of the tomb proper, and an opening in the wall, by which one could look down upon it. This passage was known only to the holy women. Above the grotto they built a chapel of wood and wickerwork, and hung it with mats and tapestry. The little altar consisted of a stone slab. The step, too, was of stone. Behind the altar hung a strip of stuff on which was sewed or embroidered quite simply, in the colors of her festal robes, a picture of Mary. The little garden in front of the tomb, and especially the whole of Mary's way of the cross, was beautified by them. While engaged in this task of love, they prayed continually and chanted psalms. The apartment of the house in which Mary had had her oratory and sleeping alcove was converted into a little church. Mary's maid continued her abode in the front part of the house, and 2 of the disciples were left there by Peter for the benefit of the faithful dwelling in that section of the country. The apostles, with tears and embraces, took leave of one another after they had once more celebrated solemn service in Mary's house. An apostle or disciple often returned at different times to pray there. I saw also that here and there, out of devotion and in reverence for the Blessed Virgin, churches were built by the faithful in the same style as her house, and that her way of the cross and her tomb were for a long time devoutly visited by the Christians. I had a vision of those early times just after Mary's assumption into heaven. A woman living near Ephesus who entertained great love for Mary visited her house. On her return, she caused an altar like that she had seen there to be made, and covered it with a very costly cloth of tapestry. The woman was very poor, and had to defray the debt she thereby incurred by the sale of a piece of her property. Finding herself after some time in dire distress, she went, though very sorrowfully, to a married Christian, and sold to her the beautiful altar. I saw the fall of the angels, the creation of the earth and paradise, that of Adam and Eve, and the fall of man. I thought everyone saw this as we do other things around us, and I spoke of it freely to my parents, brothers, sisters, and playmates. I had these visions by night and by day, in the fields, in the house, sitting or walking, and when engaged in all kinds of employments. One day at school, I happened to speak of the resurrection, describing it differently from what we had been taught. I felt certain that everyone knew it just as I did. I did not dream that there was anything peculiar in my account of it. But the children gazed at me in wonder and laughed, while the master reproved me gravely and warned me not to indulge such imaginations. My visions continued, but I kept them to myself. I was like a child looking at a picture book, explaining the pictures in its own way, but not thinking much about their meaning. They represented the saints or scenes from sacred history, sometimes in one way, sometimes in another. They produced no change in my faith. They were merely my picture book. I gazed upon them quietly and always with the good thought, all to the greater glory of God. In spiritual things, I have never put faith in anything but what God the Lord has revealed to the Catholic Church for our belief, whether it be written or not. I have never believed so firmly what I have seen in vision. I looked upon the latter as I devoutly regard, here and there, the various cribs at Christmas. I feel no annoyance at their difference in style, for in each I adore the same dear little infant Jesus. And so it is with those pictures of the creation of heaven, earth, and man. In them I adore God the Lord, the Almighty Creator of heaven and earth. I saw spreading out before me a boundless, resplendent space, above which floated a globe of light shining like a sun. I felt that it was the unity of the Trinity. In my own mind, I named it the One Voice, and I watched it producing its effects. Below the globe of light arose concentric circles of radiant choirs of spirits, wondrously bright and strong and beautiful. This second world of light floated like a sun under that higher sun. These choirs came forth from the higher sun, as if born of love. Suddenly I saw some of them pause, wrapped in the contemplation of their own beauty. They took complacency in self. They sought the highest beauty in self. They thought but of self. They existed but in self. At first all were lost in contemplation, out of self, but soon some of them rested in self. At that instant I saw this part of the glittering choirs hurled down, their beauty sunk in darkness, while the others, thronging quickly together, filled up their vacant places. And now the good angels occupied a smaller space. I did not see them leaving their places to pursue and combat the fallen choirs. The bad angels rested in self and fell away, while those that did not follow their example thronged into their vacant places. All this was instantaneous. Then rising from below, I saw a dark disk, the future abode of the fallen spirits. I saw that they took possession of it against their will. It was much smaller than the sphere from which they had fallen, and they appeared to me to be closely crowded together. I saw the fall of the angels in my childhood, and ever after, day and night, I dreaded their influence. I thought they must do great harm to the earth, for they are always around it. It is well they have no bodies, else they would obscure the light of the sun. We should see them floating around us like shadows. Immediately after the fall, I saw the spirits in the shining circles humbling themselves before God. They did homage to him and implored pardon for the fallen angels. At that moment, I saw a movement in the luminous sphere in which God dwelt. Until then, it had been motionless and, as I felt, awaiting that prayer. After that action on the part of the angelic choirs, I felt assured that they would remain steadfast, that they would never fall away. It was made known to me that God, in his judgment, in his eternal sentence against the rebel angels, decreed the reign of strife until their vacant thrones are filled. But to fill those thrones seemed to me almost impossible, for it would take so long. The strife will, however, be upon the earth. There will be no strife above, for God has so ordained. After I had received this assurance, I could no longer sympathize with Lucifer, for I saw that he had cast himself down by his own free, wicked will. Neither could I feel such anger against Adam. On the contrary, I felt great sympathy for him because I thought, it has been thus ordained. Immediately after the prayer of the faithful choirs and that movement in the Godhead, I saw below me, not far from and to the right of the world of shadows, another dark globe arise. I fixed my eyes steadily upon it. I beheld it as if in movement, growing larger and larger, as it were, bright spots breaking out upon it and encircling it like luminous bands. Here and there they stretched out into brighter, broader plains. And at that moment I saw the form of the land setting boundaries to the water. In the bright places I saw a movement as of life, and on the land I beheld vegetation springing forth and myriads of living things arising. Child that I was, I fancied the plants were moving about. Up to this moment there was only a gray light like the sunrise, like early morn breaking over the earth, like nature awakening from sleep. And now all other parts of the picture faded. The sky became blue, the sun burst forth, but I saw only one part of the earth lighted up and shining. That spot was charming, glorious, and I thought, there's paradise. While these changes were going on upon the dark globe, I saw, as it were, a streaming forth of light out of that highest of all the spheres, the God sphere, that sphere in which God dwelt. It was as if the sun rose higher in the heavens, as if bright morning were awakening. It was the first morning. No created being had any knowledge of it, and it seemed as if all those created things had been there forever in their unsullied innocence. As the sun rose higher, I saw the plants and trees growing larger and larger. The waters became clearer and holier. Colors grew purer and brighter. All was unspeakably charming. Creation was not then as it is now. Plants and flowers and trees had other forms. They are wild and misshapen now compared with what they were, for all things are now thoroughly degenerate. When looking at the plants and fruits of our gardens, apricots, for instance, which in southern climes are, as I have seen, so different from ours, so large, magnificent, and delicious, I often think, as miserable as are our fruits compared with those of the south, are the latter when compared with the fruits of paradise. I saw there roses, white and red, and I thought them symbols of Christ's passion and our redemption. I saw also palm trees and others, high and spreading, which cast their branches afar, as if forming roofs. Before the sun appeared, earthly things were puny, but in his beams they gradually increased in size until they attained full growth. The trees did not stand close together. Of all plants, at least of the largest, I saw only one of each kind, and they stood apart like seedlings set out in a garden bed. Vegetation was luxuriant, perfectly green, of a species pure, sound, and exempt from decay. Nothing appeared to receive or to need the attention of an earthly gardener. I thought, how is it that all is so beautiful, since as yet there are no human beings? Ah, sin has not yet entered. There has been no destruction, no rending asunder. All is sound, all is holy. As yet there has been no healing, no repairing. All is pure, nothing has needed purification. The plain that I beheld was gently undulating and covered with vegetation. In its center rose a fountain, from all sides of which flowed streams, crossing one another and mingling their waters. I saw in them first a slight movement as of life, and then I saw living things. After that I saw, here and there among the shrubs and bushes, animals peeping forth as if just roused from sleep. They were very different from those of a later day, not at all timorous. Compared with those of our own time, they were almost as far their superior as men are superior to beasts. They were pure and noble, nimble and joyous. Words cannot describe them. I was not familiar with many of them, for I saw very few like those we have now. I saw the elephant, the stag, the camel, and even the unicorn. This last I saw also in the ark. It is remarkably gentle and affectionate, not so tall as a horse, its head more rounded in shape. I saw no asses, no insects, no wretched, loathsome creatures. These last I have always looked upon as a punishment of sin. But I saw myriads of birds, and heard the sweetest notes, as in the early morning. There were no birds of prey that I could see, nor did I hear any animals bellowing. Paradise is still in existence, but it is utterly impossible for man to reach it. I have seen that it still exists in all its splendor. It is high above the earth and in an oblique direction from it, like the dark globe of the angels fallen from heaven.
Well then, that will be all for the video this time. And as always, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us, and hopefully all of you have learned so much from the videos this year. We cannot thank all of you enough for your continuous support and prayers. And remember, please do not hesitate to let us know if you have any feedback or suggestion. We always welcome them, and please let us know in the comments below. Anyway, if you like what we do and you'd like to support us, I left a link to our PayPal donation in the description box below, and from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for your continuous support, contributions, and prayers. And until the next one, thank you so much again to all of you, and may God bless you.